Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about my experience with Letrozole or Femara. They are the same medication, I believe. One is just the generic form, and then one is not. So I took Letrozole for my first medicated cycle, and it was successful. So I want to talk a little bit about the experience that I had with Letrozole, the process that I followed for that, a little bit about the reasons why, and things like that. So I talked about in another video my experience with an ectopic pregnancy, and I also have PCOS. So because of my previous experience with my ectopic pregnancy, and then also because I have PCOS, I moved right to fertility treatment right after my ectopic pregnancy. So my doctor did make me wait one cycle to begin treatment, and in that one cycle, while I waited before starting a medicated cycle, my husband and I did have to do a bunch of tests. So included in those tests was another saline ultrasound. So I had a saline ultrasound prior to the ectopic. I also had an HSG prior to that. I did not have to repeat the HSG, but I did have to repeat the saline ultrasound. And they just wanted to make sure that after a tube was removed, that everything else still looked good in terms of my uterus and all those things. So everything came back normal, so that was good. And then my husband also had to have some genetic testing done. I did not do any genetic testing because I already know I have beta thalassemia minor. So beta thalassemia minor it's like a blood disorder or condition that is genetic. So a bunch of people in my family have this, and I already know I have it. And it doesn't affect me in any way, except for it seems like I have very low iron levels, and there's not much I can do to increase my iron levels. So they wanted my husband to be tested for this, because if we both have minor, or he had major and I had minor, I mean, he definitely doesn't have major, but if he did, that could be a problem for any kids we might have. So he was tested for that, and also for Tay-Sachs, I believe, because he is Jewish. So he had some testing done there. All came back fine, looked good. So after all the testing, that was all during my first cycle after my ectopic pregnancy and the salpingectomy I had, which is salpingectomy, if you don't know, is a surgery to remove a tube. So all of that happened in the first cycle. All of that testing we did happened in the first cycle following my ectopic pregnancy and the salpingectomy. And then the first cycle after that, so 2 cycles after losing the tube, the surgery, the ectopic, all of that, we were able to start our first medicated cycle for fertility treatment. So that cycle happened to begin on May 2nd. So I had my surgery on February 24th. So it was just a little bit over 2 months. So just a few days more than 2 months after my surgery, right? March and April were like waiting months, and then I was able to start our first fertility treatment. So for our fertility treatment, on cycle day 3, I went into the office, into my fertility clinic for a baseline ultrasound where they took a look at everything, follicles, hormone levels, all of that stuff, and then called me later that day and said, everything looks good, you're good to start this cycle. If my levels were off or anything seemed off, then they wouldn't have been able to start me on that cycle, and I would have had to wait another month, which would have been awful, but they were able to start me. So they called me that night and called in a prescription to my pharmacy for Letrozole. So they called in, I want to say like 0.25 or whatever the lowest dose that you start on Letrozole is. Might be like 2 milligrams or 2.5 milligrams or something. And I wrote a note back to my nurse, who contacted me, and I said, I really think I should start on the next level, not the base one, because I only have one tube. So normally when people are starting Letrozole, they have two sides to work with, where I only have one. So my chances are already cut in half because I only have one tube, so it means we're only working with one ovary. So I asked that of my nurse, and that's something that my doctor and I had previously talked about in one of our consultation appointments. So they wrote back and they actually called the pharmacy and upped my medication. So I started that night on cycle day 3 on 5 milligrams of Letrozole. I believe it's 5. It's whatever the second dose is. It's 2 pills. They're very, very tiny, and you take it right before bed. So I took those for 5 days. So I started on cycle day 3 and ended on cycle day 7. So I took them every night, and that was really the only thing I had to do. So I ended them on cycle day 7. On cycle day 10, I went back into the fertility clinic for another ultrasound to check my follicles. So I went in on cycle day 10, and I was really excited because I was like, oh, I think, things are going well. And I didn't really have side effects with the Letrozole, maybe like some headaches, but I think it helps when you take it at night because you're going to bed and sleeping like 7-8 hours. So any side effects that you have right away, you just don't notice because you're sleeping. So that's when my doctor had recommended me to take it. So I was fine on it. So cycle day 10, I was done with the Letrozole for a few days now, and I went in for my ultrasound to check the follicle growth. And I only had one follicle on the left side, which is the side where I have a tube, with a follicle at 10.4 millimeters. So I was really bummed because I know that you have to have follicles like around 18 to 22 for you to be able to take your trigger shot. So I was really bummed at that point, and I was like, I only had one. I had some on the right, but those don't count for me, so I only had one on the left. So I kind of took a step back, and I was like, you know what, I only need one. It's fine with one. All it takes to make a baby is one. So I went the next couple days and had another follicle scan check for cycle day 14, which 4 days later, and they would recheck, see how things were progressing. And in that time, there's no medication, no nothing. It's just whatever you were doing before. And I actually was on metformin this entire time because of the PCOS. So I had been on that since January. So they didn't take me off it. I was still taking that as regular. And then after I finished my 5 days of Letrozole, I just took prenatals and the metformin. So cycle day 14, I go back in for a follicle check, and the good news was I had a follicle on the left side at 20 millimeters. So I did have some on the right again, and they were like really good growth, but again, I only have one side to work with. So I am really happy I pushed my doctor to up my medication, because if I didn't have any on the left, I would have been so bummed about that, because then we would have to wait and start the whole process over again. So cycle day 14, everything looked good. I had one at 20 millimeters, and they said that night they wanted me to go ahead and trigger. So I went in for that appointment at 6:30 in the morning where they checked the length, and then I was to trigger that night between 6 and 9 p.m. So for those of you who don't know, a trigger is an HCG shot. So that's gonna make you ovulate and drop the eggs. So I triggered probably like 6:30, and it's a shot that goes right into your stomach, and it is a very easy shot for people who are terrified of needles. It's very easy. The needle is like, I can't even show you with my fingers because it's so small. So I did that. It goes right in your stomach, kind of more near the belly button area, but to the side. So I did it on my left side because that's where I have the tube, so I felt that was a good place for it. So I did the shot. It was not painful at all, and that was the first time I ever gave myself a shot, and it was totally fine. So I do that, and then after that, your doctor will tell you when you have timed intercourse. So we followed all their instructions, and then the following Monday, 1 week later, on cycle day 22, I went in I went in for a blood level test to check my levels, and they're not checking at this point for pregnancy, it's too soon. They're checking at this point for, they're checking for your progesterone levels, your estrogen levels to make sure that you ovulated and everything looks good. So at this point when I went in, my progesterone levels were between 10 and 12. I don't remember the exact number, but they said that they were high enough that they thought I ovulated, but they were low that if I were to get pregnant, the pregnancy wouldn't be supported because my levels were too low and my body would kind of do the natural process and I would move into another cycle. So at that point, they decided to put me on progesterone supplements. So I started with endometrin. If you don't know what that is, you can look it up, but it is a small suppository that I had to take, and I took that for 3 weeks. And I took endometrin at first because that's first my doctor recommended Crenone, but it was really hard for me to get Crenone, so I asked if I could use endometrin, and they said yes, and I'm so happy. They gave me a few samples of Crenone, and if you are able to choose between endometrin and Crenone, I would recommend going with endometrin. It is like way better. Crenone is almost like a gel, and it's just disgusting. So that was my personal preference, but so I started on endometrin. And I took that for 3 weeks. And the only reason why I took it for 3 weeks is because I was leaving the country for 2 weeks. So I started it, and then that Saturday, so that was cycle day 22, a Monday. And that Saturday, so just like, what is that, like 5 days later, I left the country. I went to London, I went to Malaysia, and I went to Japan. So I was leaving the country, so the pill form was good for me. So that would, help bring my levels up, and if I did get pregnant, help support those levels. So I had started that even before I knew if I was pregnant or not. So on Monday, that's when they checked the levels. On Friday, the day before I left for my trip, they wanted me to come in for a blood draw to see if I was pregnant. So this was not 2 weeks, and they told me that it was early, but since I was going away and I wouldn't be able to get tested until I got back, in the middle of June, that they wanted to check and see where my levels were at. So they gave me a pregnancy test, like the blood test, in the morning, and they called me that afternoon and said, it looks like it's negative. Your HCG is 1, which is very, very low. So at that point, I kind of left for my trip and was like, I'm out this cycle, and I'm already in my head, like, planning. They sent me on my trip with, like, in case my cycle started while I was gone, they sent me with Letrozole, they sent me with birth control pills to try and prolong the start of my next cycle. That way I could come back to the office for monitoring and wouldn't have to start while I was gone, but if my cycle did start, I had the Letrozole so I could start it on cycle day 3 again. So they sent me with everything I needed. I was like so nervous traveling through the airport because I had 3 weeks worth of endometrin. I had like Letrozole, I had birth control, I had my metformin, I had prenatal, so I had all this stuff. So they actually gave me a note to take with me just because I was like carrying all of it in my carry-on. And just because I was going to like 3 different countries, they were like, just take it because we don't know what each country is gonna do. So I took that with me. And actually, so I left on Saturday. On Monday, which for me was cycle day 29, I was like having really bad cramps and like just this really sore chest and like just weird things. And like normally when I start a cycle, like I don't get really bad cramps. Like, I don't know, it just was different. Like I just felt different and my chest never gets sore. So this just felt different to me. So I had packed along with me a few at-home pregnancy tests as my doctor had suggested just because it was early for me to test. So at this point on cycle day 29, which was May 30th, it had been 2 weeks since I triggered. So my doctor, she told me to wait until like the Friday, until like 14 or something days after I triggered, but I was just like impatient and I was having these symptoms, so I was like, let me test. And I tested and I got a very faint line. So I right away called my husband. He was not traveling with me because I was for work. I called my husband And I tell him, and we were so excited. I was so shocked. I did not think it would work on the first try. I just know so many people who try on the first time, and in fact, my doctor gave me enough medication. I have another trigger shot still in my refrigerator. I still have a whole 5 days worth of Letrozole, because they basically tell you like your chances of it working the first time are very low, and especially because I only have one tube. So I was like not expecting that at all, but for us it was a first time success with Letrozole. So at this point, I am pregnant. I'm in my second trimester, so it's been going really well. I mean, we had a few rough patches in the beginning along the way, but at this point it's going well, and for us the Letrozole was a success. If we decide to have a baby number 2, that would be the route that we would go. We know that it worked for us, but just because something works the first time doesn't mean it's gonna work the second time. So, I really have no idea what the future has, but at this point, the Letrozole was successful for us for the first time. And I am someone, like I said in the beginning, I have PCOS, I only have one tube, so even with those factors, it was a one-time success for us. So I will say, for me, I'm already not a big drinker, and I stopped drinking when I went on metformin in January. So I was not drinking at all. I don't drink coffee. I was eating very healthy with the Letrozole, because with PCOS, it can kind of elevate your levels and kind of be almost like similar to things like with diabetes and things, so it's just healthier to cut out sugars, I mean, with anybody, regardless of any health condition. So I was doing all of those things, and my husband was so sweet. He did it with me. No drinking, no like sugars, anything. We were just like being really healthy because we really wanted to do everything that we could for it to be successful. We were just doing everything because we didn't want to like put all the time and effort to do it, but not do our part on things that we can control. And anybody who goes through any type of fertility, any type of fertility journey, you know that you have little control over a lot of it. And a lot of it is just hormones in your body and all these things. So you do have little control over it. So we wanted to control what we could control. So for us, that was it, and it worked. So yeah, here we are now in the second trimester, and we're really excited and hopeful for the future. So that is my Letrozole success story.